So welcome to this first event in the Transition and Transformation series at the Penn Program in Environmental Humanities. It is led by Topic Director Daniel Barber. My name is Bethany Wiggin, and I'm the founding director of the Penn Program in Environmental Humanities, usually known simply as PPEH. In a minute, Daniel will introduce the topic and his vision for the series, and I'm here primarily to introduce him, as of course to also listen to the fantastic conversation I'm very much looking forward to. Before I do that, I'd like to just draw your attention to a few upcoming public events at Penn Program in Environmental Humanities. If you are a faculty member or a lecturer at Penn, I just want to draw your attention to funding opportunities we have this year to hire and work with paid public research interns for publicly engaged research and projects that you might be working on. You can check out the PPEH website, ppehlab.org, for more details, and you can also find there our most recent newsletter with many more updates. Both for the wider public and for the Penn members of the program. Most immediately this coming week, you'll see that it's the start of Climate Week across the globe, and here at Penn, organizers have put together a series of rich offerings. Together with 3 public research interns, Danny Cooper, Connor Hardy, and Shamini Okbeme, PPEH is offering a climate storytelling and story sharing workshop. We play tested this workshop this summer several times, and I can tell you it's really actually very fun. And it's also suitable for participants as young as 8th grade. So if you have an 8th grader in your life or someone older than that, please feel free to join. Participation is capped. It's an intense workshop, so we want to be able to have enough one-on-one time with you in the breakout rooms. So please, if you are interested, register right away. Also during Climate Week, you can hear a short lecture that I recorded a couple of days ago, which is called Should Climate Change Change the Curriculum? That will be online beginning next Wednesday at noon as part of Climate Week, and it will also kick off a year-long series on the topic of climate change, eco-literacy, and the liberal arts education. That's co-organized by PPEH and the college here at Penn, the undergraduate part of the School of Arts and Sciences. Now, please join me in welcoming this year's topic director, Daniel Barber. Daniel is an associate professor and chair of the graduate group in architecture at the Weitzman School of Architecture here at Penn. He's the author of A House in the Sun, Modern Architecture and Solar Energy in the Cold War, which appeared in 2016 with Oxford University Press. This year, he published Modern Architecture and Climate Design Before Air Conditioning with Princeton University Press. He is the co-editor of a series of dossiers on the subject of accumulation for the eFlux architecture platform. He's held fellowships, too many to note. Really in detail, I'll just point toward the very prestigious one from the Alexander von Humboldt Foundation. He's been a visiting professor in the Environment and Humanities at the Princeton Environmental Institute and a guest visitor in many leading institutions around the globe. As Daniel's publications and his other projects demonstrate, he's an indefatigable collaborator, and I've been so glad to collaborate with him for several years now. I'm so glad to be working with Daniel again this year on our annual topic. And in characteristic fashion, Daniel has designed programming to allow for maximal collaboration and public engagement, even in, or maybe especially in, the time of COVID. So please join me in giving Daniel a warm welcome. You can snap at home or do virtual cheers as our topic director at PPEH. Daniel will now introduce his vision and his goals for the topic year of transformation at PPEH. He'll then introduce this event as well as our distinguished speakers. Welcome, Daniel.
Thank you so much, Bethany, for this, such a kind and thoughtful introduction. I've really, I have to say that my experiences and engagements at the Environmental Humanities group at Penn have been essential to my own intellectual development and one of, really one of the most valued sites for discussion and engagement at the university and around the world. So thank you for all that you do at PPEH, which is really amazing to watch and to be a part of. And I'm very grateful for this opportunity to take on some of these pressing issues this year, which, as Bethany noted, I really see as an opportunity for discussion, for collaboration, for thinking through the set of challenges that we're all facing, thinking through these issues together. The focus of the topic, the annual topic that we've been putting together, that we're sort of starting out today, right? So welcome to all of you to our inaugural event. The focus is transition/transformation, right? And that sort of backslash, and I was going to do a PowerPoint where the slash kind of danced around a bit, but I didn't want to distract you too much. But that backslash in between is kind of important, right? It's a line that serves as a border, a boundary, perhaps even a portal, between familiar ways of thinking and the kind of endlessly unexpected challenges that we seem to be encountering every day amidst pandemics, amidst forest fires and floods and so many other events. When I wrote the précis for the sort of framing of the topic back in December, right, which of course feels like a decade ago, both sort of intellectually and somehow kind of physiologically as well. But when I wrote it at that moment, I was focused on the discussion of this kind of question of the energy transition, right, as a kind of example of a sort of model for change, and one that focuses, as many of you know, just rehearsing some of these points, on how infrastructures can be reconfigured without dramatic effects on social life, right? So this notion that through solar panels or smart grids or electric vehicles or all sorts of smart materials, et cetera, other sorts of technological fixes, that these would operate, as a colleague in architecture recently put it, quoting, so that everything changes, but everything stays the same, unquote, right? So the kind of systems that run our world are somehow carbon neutralized, right? But our lives, we don't even notice, right? We go on as before. And so just wanting to focus on how deeply and sort of frustratingly conservative that notion, that narrative of transition tends to be. And what it offers then, right, the other side of our dividing line here, what it offers is this expanded challenge and opportunity of transformation, right? Framing the climate crisis and our many other sociobiotic challenges for the ways in which they open up a pathway towards a society at once more equitable, less carbon intensive, reorganized, rearranged, and productive ways. Rather than electric cars, just to sort of play out that kind of schematic example, a city redesigned for walking, right? For different kinds of sociability, and of course the resonance around politics and public engagement and the social lives that we can imagine in that transformed space. Still somewhat powerful to me, at least. I mean, still kind of capturing some of the aspirations I think many of us likely share. But at the same time, that description from December, I don't know, it seems kind of quaint to me in its kind of embedded optimism, right? That kind of the thinking and engaging and activities and scholarly activities that we could do, how they would relate to the kind of world outside, which, if you will, has changed so dramatically. The pandemic has not only adjusted our consideration of the viability of public space or the kind of contours of its character, but has also transformed, right, changed the kind of ways that we see the struggle for hope amidst the overlapping sort of disasters and changing contours of social life that we're increasingly seeing. In addition to the catastrophic loss of life, loss of health and stability for so many, the pandemic has revealed, as we all know, deep inequality, right? Systemic racism, persistent gender bias, and a sort of confounding unwillingness that still shocks me every time I leave my house to attend to the imperatives of social directives rooted in science, which is to say wearing a mask, right? If this is, as some have suggested, a sort of rehearsal for the complex social responses to increasing climate pressures, right, if what we're seeing in the kind of struggles to resolve or engage with a way forward through the pandemic has anything to do with the kind of struggles around the pressures of climate instability, finding new ways forward, rethinking these parameters is even more, remarkably more urgent. So a good time to be considering methods and tools that can help us shake off our attachments to the familiar and embrace novel possibilities. And in many ways, that's the kind of framework that we want to play out through this series of events and discussions and engagements over this academic year. We'll start or continue here collectively as our annual topic and start the discussion today, a number of events that help us to think through, again, the kind of move into this space of transformation, built up and grounded in a lot of the important work and scholarship and community work that has been done relative to questions of transition, but perhaps a little bit more focused and with somewhat higher aspirations. So we're going to start this discussion today. We're going to get to that in a second, but first, just very briefly, some other issues, other opportunities, other events to expect over the year, to mark your calendars, right? Or maybe best just to sort of bookmark the Penn Program in Environmental Humanities events site to follow these and other events as they develop. And the links to that site, a link to that site and some of these other issues are in the chat. On November 17th, we'll welcome Elizabeth Jean-Pierre, the Executive Director of UPROSE, climate justice organization in Brooklyn and Puerto Rico, to present a talk on sort of a set of questions around bringing, understanding the role of scholarship in activism. In the spring, with some details and dates yet to be confirmed, we'll be holding a workshop similar to the format we have here on what I'm thinking of as the art and politics of community-based solar energy, right? So kind of details to come for that. And then in April, a super exciting event, again, dates and details to be clarified, a staged reading of the Indigenous futurist play, When Earth Meets the Sky. Certainly one to keep in your radar and look forward to more details. It's gonna be fun. Today's event is a great way to start us off. We're lucky to have with us scholars, architects, and planners whose work sort of lives in this space of transformation, right? We'll be discussing both the changes that have occurred in the urban and architectural sphere and this sort of rapid response sense of trying to grapple with collectively, what are the new stakes, what are the new challenges in the face of our transforming world, how these impact and inflect our collective efforts towards an equitable post-carbon way of life. So I'm going to briefly thank Angela Ferranda, who has done the kind of organizational assistance in putting this event together. Also point you to another link to bookmark also in the chat, the Environmental Humanities Project on COVID x Climate, of which this event is a part, a collection of texts and videos and interventions organized by Anna Berg, Assistant Professor of History at Penn, and Connor Gavin, one of the program's graduate research fellows. So again, a broader context where this discussion will continue. So I'm about to introduce our panelists and get us started, but just quickly to note, to sort of map out how we're going to proceed today, to give you a sense of what to expect. Our panelists will each make brief presentations, about 10 minutes each. When they're done, we'll come together and have some discussion sort of here on the stage, so to speak, right? Amongst the panelists and Bethany and I as moderators. That would also be a good time to sort of clarify your own questions. Once we spend a little bit of time with that, we'll move to an open Q&A. If you have a question, please put it in the chat. Bethany and I will gather them and ask them to the group. This will allow your voices to be part of this conversation while avoiding any potential technical mishaps. And in fact, if you're comfortable when asking your question, go ahead and just drop a line, start with a line about who you are, your name, kind of student or faculty, field or interests, whatever might be appropriate. Just so we have some context for the sort of questions in the discussion and can, helps us a little bit to pretend like we're not all just staring at a screen, right? So if that's something you're willing to do, please do so. And just to, make clear that we're anxious to hear from everyone in the room. You are all welcome to join in. Students, junior scholars, professionals, others, don't hold back. Okay, so I'm very happy to have with us today this amazing group of scholars and practitioners for this rapid response workshop on pandemics, urban health, and the global interior. Given these kind of lengthy preambles, I'm going to do relatively rapid bios. Link again in the chat to the events page that has more details on each of them, details on some of their publications and further affiliations. So I'm going to introduce all four of them in the order they will present, and then in effect turn over the platform to the panelists. So we'll start with Kian Go. Kian is Assistant Professor of Urban Planning at the University of California, Los Angeles, where she researches the relationship between urban ecological design, spatial politics, and social mobilization. Her recent article entitled Urbanizing Climate Justice, just as kind of one flag, really sort of refigures the role and aspirations for planning. And I would strongly encourage you to take a look at it. I think it'll be one that we reference for many years to come. After Kian, we'll hear from Jaque, an architect, writer, and curator, and founder of the Office of Political Innovation, a New York-based collective operating at the intersection of design, research, and critical environmental practice. He directs the Advanced Architecture Design program at Columbia's Graduate School of Architecture Planning and Preservation, and is also the chief curator of the upcoming Shanghai Biennale. Following, Shalanda Baker is a professor of law, public policy, and urban affairs at Northeastern University, where she researches equity and energy, a valuable and crucial nexus for our thoughts around the present and the future. Again, a recent essay of hers in the Harvard Civil Rights and Civil Rights and Civil Liberties Review on anti-resilience is a kind of inspiring intervention in this crucial discussion. Another sort of flag that I think will mark our discussions going forward for some time, as will no doubt her forthcoming book that I'm very excited to read, Revolutionary Power, An Activist's Guide to the Energy Transition. So looking forward to that. And then our final speaker, Ivan Munuera, is a scholar, critic, and curator exploring culture, technology, and politics in the context of bodily practices, relative in particular to a fascinating project on the architecture of HIV and AIDS. His writing and projects have been published and exhibited widely. A fascinating article just released yesterday, I think, that I was happy to have the chance to read, on unzipped parties, part of the Russian Federation Pavilion's entry to the Venice Biennale, recently, again, published yesterday on Efflux Architecture, so another one to take a look at. So, okay, I don't know, I hope that makes you as excited as it's made me for the past kind of week as I've been anticipating this, and we're all kind of strapped in and ready to go. I'll turn it over to Kian. Thank you.
Thank you, Daniel. I will do this thing where I get my screen going.
All right, take your time.
Okay, so you should see a screen with a title called Urban Resilience and Mutual Aid. So thanks again, Daniel. Thanks, Bethany. And it's a real pleasure to be here. These are topics that are right front and center for us, like very sort of dear and pressing to me. So I want to talk about today urban resilience and mutual aid. Let's see. Okay. So here we have a backyard in Los Angeles in June, and it was really the first time that my partner and I had really left our house to go somewhere and hang out with people to do things since March when we went under lockdown. And what we were doing was putting together survival bags for LA CAN, the Los Angeles Community Action Network, who have had a long-standing project working with and alongside unhoused folks in downtown Los Angeles. And as the pandemic hit, sort of accelerated their efforts to provide food, provide hand washing stations, and really check in on our unhoused neighbors in and around the downtown LA region. And when we did this, two things, right? We were totally crazy at home and we really wanted to go out. and do something. And this seemed one way that we could really like, firstly, justify that risk to do something that we felt should be done. And at the same time, it also sort of really spoke to what I was feeling as this increasing attention to the possibilities of mutual aid during pandemic times. And in some ways, like this is something that has really like caught the attention of so many folks in around so many places. So mutual aid, not a new thing by any chance, by any stretch of the imagination, but it's a kind of notion of social and political participation, often by and for those most oppressed, most in need, to survive, to help each other to survive and to challenge unjust and oppressive systems. So in the words of those who are proponents of this, solidarity and not charity. So kind of like politically engaged volunteer actions. And we see some of the key examples historically, such as the Black Panther Party's breakfast programs and health clinics in the Oakland area. And in a pandemic, what these mutual aid actions do is they bring up new ways for us to think about this idea of solidarity and proximity, showing how both a physical closeness, which often underlies mutual aid efforts, and extended networks of political organizing and political vision can work together to provide direct aid to a wider group of people than we would otherwise be able to do. And they're a kind of a comfort in a time where you know, we cannot do the kinds of face-to-face community building that we would prefer. And so these actions, particularly like this year, really made me think about the kinds of on the ground, community-based actions for resilience that I've been really trying to search out in my own research. So resilience is a super contested topic. On the one hand, celebrated by policymakers, by scholars, by a whole bunch of like funders, for people and places to be able to bounce back from disasters. But bounce back to what? And I know Shalanda is going to be really talking about this too. Bounce back to what? The kinds of, you know, the kinds of quandaries that have gotten us into this mess in the first place. And so there's been a bit of a rising critique of this notion of resilience by scholars and activists, like you know, as Tracy L. Washington here says, stop calling me resilient. Every time you say, oh, they're resilient, it means you can do something else to me, right? At the same time, you know, I see and I want to hold up these possibilities of a kind of resilience from below, that the examples of which I have observed and I want to understand better. So in some of my core research, I look at the spatial politics of urban climate change responses, and I have a book I'm finishing up, hopefully out, I don't know, sometime next year, hopefully sometime next year, on this, on the spatial politics of climate change responses, looking at flows of ideas and influence between New York, Jakarta, and Rotterdam. And I'll focus on New York for the moment. So after Hurricane Sandy in 2012, you know, a kind of like prominent center of post-disaster resilience planning epitomized, you know, in the Rebuild by Design competition, this well-known example, the Big U project by the team led by Big, which tries to explicitly marry infrastructure and community by saying, you know, like, well, essentially saying we're going to hybridize Robert Moses and Jane Jacobs. I won't spend too much time on this, but what I want to bring up really is an alternate view of the post-Sandy happenings. So one of the neighborhoods that was most most hard hit by Sandy was Red Hook. And I had Red Hook in Brooklyn. I had spent some time in Red Hook. I worked with the Red Hook Initiative as an architect and designer, converting a warehouse to be their headquarters. And so when the storm hit, you know, I was really concerned about the folks with whom I had worked on this project. But in the days following, so the Red Hook space emerged relatively safe. It was just like a few feet from where the waters came up. And in the days following, it turned into this kind of center, this command and control center for neighborhood recovery. So staff members and volunteers from Occupy Sandy set up a soup kitchen in the Red Hook, the RHI space. The Red Hook Wi-Fi network, that was like a community-based mesh network for neighborhood broadband, was used by disaster recovery officials to build a communications network because so much of the larger infrastructure was not working. And it really became, and they used social media to get folks to come volunteer, to get the word out. And it really became this example of how community social relationships and community building work with design and space towards a kind of social environmental resilience. And this was even in the face of continued structural impediments. So right after the storm, you can see here, the city put up these temporary boilers right by the Red Hook houses, which is I've left out parts of the story, but no worries. These temporary boilers by the Red Hook houses, which is the largest NYCHA public housing project in Brooklyn. And, you know, 7 years after, till mid last year, they remained. And it's only, I believe, right now that they're pushing along some projects in order to make the Red Hook houses, to renovate the Red Hook houses. And so for me, I was really trying to understand how the Red Hook Initiative was able to be this, actually, this particularly, I think, like convincing, compelling example of community-based ground-up resilience after the storm. So some of what I did was observe some of the work of the Red Hook Initiative. I've looked at the words of those folks, constituents, and staff members who are part of this effort. And I've spoken to Jill Eisenhardt, the executive director of RHI, multiple times in depth. And I'll just share a few quotes from their work. So you talk about resilience. I think for people in public housing by December, they were like, my lights are on, everything is fine. Why are people still talking about this? Because when you're a low-income New Yorker and you've always been marginalized, stuff like this happens all the time. It's not always on the national news. Again, Jill Eisenhardt. Before October 2012, we talked about resilience every day, and our definition was this: life will inevitably knock you down. You need to be able to get up again. Resilience is being able to know that you have the strength or knowledge or self-belief or motivation or confidence within yourself to get up and try again. And that you also have a social support network around you that is going to help you if you can't do that for yourself. she goes on, you need to be able to recognize that the people from a community have the power to create their own social change, and investing in people. There's social capital that's there. You have to create opportunities for people to take action ahead of time. And one thing I kept pressing Jill about was like, why did it happen here? Why did it happen here? And one of the things that she kept emphasizing is about the place-based nature of this. So she says, I think the number one thing is location. If you took our exact same building and design and moved it 6 blocks away, you would have a different response. I think that is the first part. It's where it's positioned within the neighborhood and within our target population. So Daniel, how am I doing for time?
You're pretty much done. Sorry,
I'm pretty much
just
done.
trying to find a good point to wave at you. Yeah.
Okay, I'll just end with like what I think we learned from this example. Number one, I think the specific condition of social and spatial marginalization actually matters. How RHI was able to build from the community's shared struggles as a community living in public housing in a rapidly gentrifying part of Brooklyn. Individual strength and belief matters, but also this social support network. I think importantly is a particular positional view of change from within a historical social context. And that's why I think resilience cannot simply be invoked without that notion of historical power relationships. And then I think importantly for our conversation today, place matters. Social and spatial marginalization is place-based and location-specific. And that brings up some of the potential and challenges when we think about the constraints that COVID and the pandemic have enforced on us. So I'll stop there for now.
Thank you so much. So fascinating. And yeah, I can't wait to start to ask some questions. Thanks again. Andres, do you want to take the screen, as it were? Yeah. Thank you. Andres, you're muted.
Yeah,
there
thank
we
you
go.
very much,
Perfect.
Daniel. And I'm excited to be with all of you here and have a very needed discussion. So happy about that. When like 1 month after, 2 months, a couple of months after the entire COVID-19 pandemic started, there were images like this circulating all around, in which basically there was a possibility to segregate climate, environment, pollution, and see it from above, from these satellite images, as something that was disentangled with other things, as a proof that in itself could be described and could be something that would allow evaluate how the pandemic was, or according to many of the interpretations, creating an environmental climatic change. Somehow, the question is, what is the way that we can move across scales when it comes to discuss climate? And how do we do that? It's probably very different to the way that architecture has been discussing images like this one and interiors like this one in regards with to environment. This is, of course, the 1976 conversation, TV conversation or broadcasted conversation between Frost and Nixon, 6 years after Nixon or his administration created the Environmental Protection Agency. This is an image that was very much commented during the COVID pandemic. In March 17, the Big Brother in Germany, these people were not aware of what was going on in the world, and they were totally disconnected to that reality. And the images of how they were sharing the bath were actually outrageous to already a population that was thinking of distancing, social distancing. If we think of other images that started to circulate, we see how these images were showing, or were kind of showing, the end of a time of the connection between media and medium, or media and environment, or the way interiors would gained transcalarity through the discussion of environment and ecology and climate. But there were other spaces that started to be important to understand how interiors operated. And one of them, for us, for instance, taxes. Taxes became crucial to discuss inequality through environment and connecting it to interiors in a very radical way. We would see, for instance, inequality being expressed through these infrastructures, temporary infrastructures, similar to the boilers that Kian was showing, but these were in Fifth Avenue, trying to relocate the width of band to those premium users, or creating basically an infrastructure or reprogramming infrastructures through inequality as a premium product to be offered to clients on Fifth Avenue, basically here. That came to the details of actually how air moved and the expansion of negative pressure rooms across the world, and the way that they became actually interiors that were also operating as media interiors, mediums that were regulated through media and that would actually indicate what was the direction of which contagious could be promoted. These are a few details, but I think that it's very important to acknowledge that this was, again, offered around the world by private hospitals as a premium product for those that could pay for it, as a way to maximize their capacity to survive the disease. And that came to the details of how architecture would deal with pressure, sort of an intervention directly on the environment, on the air, on the atmospheres, as a means to produce inequality in interiors through architectural calibration. It's, in my opinion, no accidental that glass became part of protest in Hong Kong, and the way that many were identifying glass as a material that was both enacting and kind of making visible the way Chinese corporations were expanding into Hong Kong and the way that they were reorganizing Hong Kong society. And I want to talk about glass now. And this is 432 that we all see as such a critical presence in New York, but that it's not that easy to understand how it's designed. It's part of this redesign of climate as something that is meant to produce inequality, or at least the illusion that those that are powerful can escape from climatic or climate crisis. This is the window of 432. And the glass is invisible. It's literally invisible. It's actually hidden. It has no frame. There's no millions. And this is the way it was represented for the first time when D-Box, the architectural rendering company, was developing the concept for the building. So there was no structure. There was no mechanical services. There was just this way of owning the landscape, owning the environment. This capacity to project from the inside outdoors, so kind of outwards, and own it, or sort of a commodified a product that seems to be even an artwork. And that was done through a very particular number of architectural calibrations that were operating in association with other means of action. The first one, the one that I'm obsessed with, is the ultra clear glass, a glass that is twice as expensive as any ordinary glass, and that still is being used massively in all the mega towers that are being built now in Manhattan. The one on the left is the ultra clear low iron glass, on the right the conventional one. In my opinion, this is highly connected, and it's the way for, or one of the ways for architecture to connect with things that are happening at other scales and that are equally architectural or equally designed. Bloomberg's plan to attract billionaires was, of course, developed through the technology of allowing LLC companies to buy real estate property as a way to attract money from around the world that was, its origin was not scrutinized, but also the capacity to gain tax deductions. That was actually one of the innovations that made possible the presence of Trump and the development of TransPower in Manhattan. When we see the way that the press depicted tax havens, it's very naive the way architecture is depicted. It's like this kind of remote, kind of peculiar and tropical architecture in islands, Whereas when we see, for instance, the way the European Union in 2015 struggled to define what a tax haven is, precisely the problem was that Luxembourg, Japan, Germany, Turkey, Chile, Israel, Guatemala, Belgium, Ireland, Canada, Brazil, Austria, all of them were basically technically tax havens, not for everyone, but selectively for those that could find or could have access to the financial products like real estate that of certain high-end real estate that would allow them to evade or avoid taxes. And this is basically what we see here connected. Owning the environment, it's also the capacity to avoid taxes, but also that translates literally in architectural details. This is the glass that was used in 432 Park Avenue. It's a low iron glass that increases or sort of intensifies the blue spectrum of the natural light. So when you see from the inside outside or towards outside, basically you see the sky bluer. This glass basically means or implies or achieves that you see through it and you see things blue. This is actually something that is all around, like basically all these interiors, all these high-end interiors perceive a different sky of that we could see through ordinary glass. And that is connected to the transformation of people. This is one of the renderings with Christina Makowski's Sport Illustrated models that was used to sell these apartments, 432. This was designed by D-Box, and all these people are actors, except this guy here, who is a real businessman from New Jersey, friend of Harry Marklow, that was brought here for everyone to believe that if they buy the apartment, they could be, let's say, successful sexually. And that also applies to reproduction. This is Dr. San, who is in Columbus Circle, in one of the Time Warner Towers, established this clinic that is offering international fertility services and free-parent fertility. This is the celebrities chamber, where basically he helps design children according to a catalog of donors that look alike celebrities like Jess Franco or Jin Hee. This is the three-parent baby technique that Dr. Sang invented and patented, and that is massively used by international clients with high profile financially to design their kids. Actually, in the same location where these apartments are sold, in Columbus Circle, that, as you know, was followed by the New York Times as this location for hidden fortunes. When we see now the Clean Heat project by Bloomberg, started in 2007, presented here in a press conference in 2011 with this image of smoke coming out buildings and proposing or kind of incentivizing the use of natural gas. We see how that combined with something that both, of course, both politics very well intended, but resulted in basically a displacement of pollution to Susquehanna Valley, where natural gas was extracted through fracking, 30,000 miles of polluted aquifers. But not only that, and this is something that Marines Linares and myself have been following for 3 years now, in cooperation with people that have been doing for many years, scrutinizing the evolution of the air in Susquehanna Valley. And basically this is the evolution of NOx in Susquehanna. So basically the pollution that was removed from Manhattan was traveling to other places. And there was a very, very dramatic implications of the politics of Bloomberg and Cuomo in the way that toxicity traveled to areas with low income population. Areas like this one, this is a map that we got after years of kind of following landmen in Pennsylvania. We could get this with the support of some activists, but this is basically the properties, the mineral rights that were owned by a company, Cabot Company, in an area in Susquehanna And this is the way that the mineral rights were consolidated and depicted with the digital terminals that were introduced in the fracking bits in the heads of the fracking bits. So basically, what we're seeing is that this kind of fragmented lotting on top is translating in this huge consolidation of the gas owned by one single company, Cabot Company. This is the question for me. I don't think COVID meant any progress in terms of environmental advancement, but actually it revealed the way power is imbricated, is embedded in the way our trans-scalar connections are being designed. Thank you.
Fabulous, fabulous. Thank you so much.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you so much. Such a rich set of images and discussions and examples. I'll turn it over to Shalanda. Great. Here we go.
Great. Can everyone hear me? Okay, excellent. I just want to say thank you to Daniel and Bethany and Angela for putting this together. I'm so honored to be on such a distinguished panel, and I've already learned so much. My mind is absolutely blown. So over the past 5 or 6 months, I've been working on kind of connecting the dots among race, COVID-19, and energy justice, which is the work that I do. I don't think we can have a panel today that discusses the connections between COVID and climate without also excavating energy policy and how it is implicated in this particular moment. Before I get started on my actual presentation, I just want to introduce the rest of my team. So I'm a professor by day, and I also run what is called the Initiative for Energy Justice by night. I don't know when I sleep, but our team is comprised of attorneys. We are all folks with deep expertise in energy policy, and we came together because in the places where we worked, I was in Hawaii, Subin, who's in the middle here, was in California, and Shiva was in New York. We realized that there was a real disconnect between the communities who were the first and worst impacted by climate change and their hopes and dreams, and policymakers who were sort of crafting energy transition policy without equity and without issues of social justice at the center. And so we do research that is informed by frontline perspectives, and we also support policymakers who are really committed to centering equity in their energy policy work. So I want to talk a little bit about this moment, and then I want to connect COVID and environmental justice, which I think was sort of an undercurrent in a couple of the first couple of presentations as well, and then briefly touch on energy justice and energy policy in this particular moment. So what is this moment? You know, I think we have now all witnessed and been a part of these broad conversations around what is going on right now. I mean, when people say 2020, I mean, we can think of so many different things that pop up, but I see this moment really as a reckoning. And I think it's a reckoning not only with our history of racial injustice in this country, but it's a reckoning with the systems and the structures that we have come to sort of see as natural and inevitable parts of our society. And it's an opportunity to really invert and disrupt those structures. It's also a reckoning with the folks that we have not seen as visible in our society, right? The essential yet expendable people that have so often found themselves on the wrong end of the COVID-19 pandemic. And so again, the energy system is implicated in both of those aspects. It's implicated in terms of our understanding of racial justice right now. It's also implicated in our understanding of who is expendable due to the design of energy policy. So just to kind of throw out a couple of facts, not to get too into the weeds, but pretty early on in this pandemic, so April, we had an understanding that this pandemic would have disproportionate impacts on African Americans and BIPOC communities in general. And so here is an early on kind of analysis, again, 1,000,000 years ago. So Daniel, I relate to the idea that December was like a decade ago. April feels like 100 years ago as well. We have Louisiana, Illinois, Michigan showing disproportionate death rates or percentages as compared to their overall share of the population. Chicago also showing pretty stark death percentages as compared to the overall percentage of African Americans in that particular city. And then fast forward just a couple months to July, which was only a couple months ago, the New York Times published its what it's called fullest look at racial inequality in the coronavirus. So this study was only possible after the New York Times sued the CDC for data. And so what they discovered is that African Americans and Latinx folks are 3 times as likely to be infected as their white neighbors by COVID-19, and Black and Latinx people have been nearly as twice as likely to die from the virus. So this is astonishing in this country today. And there was also a recent study, I haven't gotten to look at it, but I did hear about it yesterday, that illustrated that our children, Black and brown children, are dying at disproportionate rates in this pandemic. So we have a lot to grapple with. And there are a lot of reasons for the disproportionate exposure rate that relate back to the way we have designed our economic system. Black and Latinx people are more likely to be in jobs that are deemed essential and less likely to have the jobs that allow them to work from home, like all of us are probably doing today. The disproportionate death rates are a little bit more complicated, but they can also be traced back to structural racism. And so this was a study that was published back in April by researchers at the Harvard Chan School of Public Health. I'm seeing Kian nod, perhaps saw this, but their study revealed that air pollution was at least one contributing factor that increase the COVID-19 death rate. And so the long-term exposure increases the likelihood that a person will have one of the comorbidities, such as asthma, that leads to complications from COVID-19. And so studies in this country have long demonstrated that Black and brown communities here are more likely to live near polluting facilities. I'm sure when Elizabeth comes in a couple months, she'll be able to talk a little bit about that. But so Black and brown folks are more likely to live near polluting facilities as well as fossil fuel generation. And for 30 years, we've had scholars in the environmental justice movement really try to shine a light on that and begin to remediate some of that harm. But the environmental racism that is evident in this slide traces back to decisions that were made in energy policy and environmental policy. And these are decisions that are decades long, but now they're coming to the surface yet again with the COVID-19 pandemic. And I should say that these aren't abstractions. So my team and I, again, this summer, began to just poke around and figure out what was going on in the Boston area, which is where I live. This is a slide that shows the case rate for COVID-19 here in the Boston area. And I know many of you are probably not from Boston, so I've circled an area that has a pretty high concentration of COVID-19. Rosendale, Mattapan, Dorchester, Hyde Park, these are predominantly Black and brown communities. Just to the northeast of that, we have Chelsea, Everett, Revere, and Chelsea, I want to highlight, had the highest COVID-19 infection rates in the country. And that is a predominantly Latinx community that is predominantly immigrant as well. And so this is a look at the hazards, the respiratory hazards that those communities face. And again, I just wanted to circle and highlight that the same communities that are impacted by high rates of COVID-19 infection are also in the sort of corridor of environmental justice harms in this city. So we have Roxbury, Dorchester, Mattapan again, and at the top you can also see, if I point out, Chelsea. So when we look at these things side by side, we can see that our pattern locally mirrors the national discourse with respect to exposure. So Black and brown communities having higher exposure rates. We also wanted to get our arms around the death rates, which is dark, but we wanted to understand how COVID was playing out in some of these communities. We have not yet been able to get our arms around that public health data due to privacy concerns and other things, but we're still working to try to figure out how all of these pieces align. And so I want to get to the transition piece of this and the transformation piece. And I love this slide because it sort of connects the racial justice aspects that we're all grappling with the environmental justice aspects of this current moment that have become more and more apparent. So this idea that we can't breathe is one that is not just connected to a knee on the neck of a Black person or a chokehold around the neck of a Black or brown body, but it's also connected to the decades of environmental justice harms and hazards that communities of color have faced. And this image on the right is actually not from Boston, it's from Port Arthur, Texas, which is where my family is from. My dad's side is from there, and Port Arthur is a majority Black and brown community where it is also the sort of nexus of the modern fossil fuel system and the birthplace of the modern fossil fuel industry. So how do we think about transition and transformation in this moment? So I'm taking us back again to Boston, to the communities that are environmental justice communities. They're heavily impacted by COVID. And we wanted to sort of understand where the opportunities for justice were. And we wanted to sort of think about access to solar, which is, you know, the pathway out, right? Distributed energy generation. And we had pulled data from way back in December on solar in connection with another project, but we just wanted to overlay solar access to those same communities. And on the left, we have, again, Roxbury, Dorchester, Mattapan, with not a lot of solar access. You may notice the big green circle in Mattapan. That's just a couple of streets with more solar than the rest of the community. We wanted to understand why that was there. But in general, when we think about solar access, our communities of color in Boston don't have as much access, whereas on the right, this is Needham, Wellesley, Newton, fairly affluent, predominantly white communities that have much more solar in comparison. So there's an access issue in terms of beginning to unwind and remedy some of the environmental justice issues. But what we also saw, I wanted to understand if even in the communities that did have access to solar, if there was a difference in the type of solar that they got. And again, this is a rough analysis, it's unpublished, we're working on putting some of this out in the world. We found that those same communities, Rosendale, Hyde Park, Dorchester, Mattapan, didn't have access to directly owned solar at the same rates that other more affluent communities had. And this is important. You may recall a viral video that went around this summer where there was a Black woman saying, why are we burning down our communities? Why are we burning downtown? Because we don't own it. None of it is ours. And the process of this energy transition is taking place with the same sort of logics of extraction and capitalism and exclusion that predominate the fossil fuel development era. So this is a real chance for us to highlight these disparities and then try to close some of these gaps. And so right now, even when communities have access to solar, they simply don't own it. So I'll move quickly, have a couple more slides. Am I okay, Daniel?
You're pretty much done. If you could start to close up. Sorry, that seems to be my only response to that question.
So
yeah, if you could.
Yeah, I will absolutely wrap it up. So energy justice is a framework that allows us to think about centering equity and the concerns of communities of color as we create energy policy. And there are just a few things that we can think about in advancing energy justice in this moment. We need to recognize the prior harms that communities have faced. We need to include the voices of frontline communities, BIPOC communities in energy policymaking. We can unpack all of this during discussion. And we need to adopt transitional policies that actually are transformative. So I love that dichotomy there, or that connection. And so these would be policies that center Black and Brown communities and target them for ownership of new energy resources. And we also need to reduce energy burden in certain communities. And that's all I have. Thanks for plugging my book earlier, Daniel, but that's also a book coming out soon.
Great, great, thank you. And I'm sorry to have to rush that through. That slide was full of some great material. So maybe we will have a chance to jump back to it. We'll keep going. Yvonne, take the stage, and yeah, look forward to it.
Okay. Well, of course, many thanks for organizing this, Daniel, and for sharing this fantastic conversation with such an amazing bunch of speakers. I think that actually my intervention will work as a kind of recap of some of the things that have been already said, like, for example, mutual aid and rebellion from Kian, the different scales of architecture by Andres, and the econo-racist and neo-colonial regime highlighted through COVID-19 that Shalanda has brilliantly presented. I would like to start precisely with some of these images that since the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic, there has been a flood of architectural images from the past that try to relate specific objects with the different examples taken from the architectural imageries. The usage of certain protective gear, like masks, has been compared to the likes of House Co, or the construction of ephemeral buildings, like this three-week building hospital in Wuhan was compared to these ephemeral or plug-in cities by Archigram, or even the at the very beginning, the Diamond Princess cruise with OMA's design of the constructivist pool floating in the ocean and containing a world in itself. Well, both, I think, these images and this approach to architectural history relates on a definition of architecture as an autonomous entity, a series of objects isolated from their environment that act as solutions for a specific crisis. It's not only that this parallelism is superficial, I would say. For example, the usage of masks are not related to this super individualism that was happening precisely with the radical architects of the 60s, but to collective caring right now, the usage of masks, I would say. So it's not a bubble for one subject, but it's also a collective caring for a community. And that takes into account other humans and non-human agents. The question then is that the very definition of architecture has changed and needs a new perspective. I'm pushing for a new perspective that takes into account the very definition of the architectural subject and its relationship with their environment as part of an environment. A definition of architecture as an intersectional discipline that doesn't produce autonomous entities, new gadgets, let's say, but one that negotiates the terms of coexistence with both human and non-human agents to create a shared environment, to be part of a shared environment. The global response to the pandemic has been concentrated, I would say, on the dislocation of the human body, a reification of an anthropocentric notion of a self-contained body that should be isolated in heteronormative shared spaces, aka the home. Not so different from this idea of the Smithsons with the House of the Future, that everything is under control and the humans are living there completely isolated. For many, this hasn't been an option, just like Shalanda was saying about the expendables. Victims of gender violence, the homeless, migrants, displaced communities, sex workers, essential workers, from people working on delivery services to public transportation drivers, couldn't find any kind of safety in the so-called home, or they had been forcibly pushed out from the domestic realm. COVID-19 has put in crisis this definition, pushing for a notion of body far from the definition of a discrete and autonomous being, rather a recomposition between human and non-human agents that pushes for an interdependent, interconnected, and not zip-up embodiments. COVID-19 has not been a global crisis, even though it has happened all over the world. There is an uneven balance of power within different nations that has affected humans and non-humans in very different ways. Socioeconomic circumstances affect the way coronavirus and its responses are embraced in different communities. It does not affect in the same way people with access to universal healthcare than those with a lack of resources, and disproportionately affecting racialized bodies all over the world. Architecture thereby assumes the form of an expanded spatial practice that involves a set of economic, social, cultural, and ecological questions that transcends its traditional disciplinary field. At the same time, we can talk about the territorialization of the coronavirus itself. COVID-19 redefines what a healthy body is, and the way humans and non-humans, in this case the coronavirus, could coexist in non-lethal ways. We have to take into account that there has been also other traditions in the way humans could coexist with epidemics and strategies for living in pathogenic environments, something that we can discuss later, maybe in the debate. As the conversation shifts to the importance of testing for antibodies, it also brings up issues for immunosuppressive people, marginalized communities, and other individuals, for example, HIV positives. This could even change the definition of citizenship. This was the first image that I faced when I arrived in Sydney at the beginning of March. This was in the airport, and there were already two lines, one from the people that were coming from inland China, and the other one that was for the people that were coming from different countries. And of course, the people that were coming from inland China were subjected to other strategies of surveillance and medical procedures. There are many different understandings of what a healthy body is, or even what a body is. We have to find ways of coexisting with unhealthy bodies, with disease, and with epidemics. Otherwise, we are actually defining different levels of citizenship and the right to be a citizen. Some of these images, maybe we can also discuss them later on. Environmental violence has increased the situations where outbreaks of epidemics can happen. In China, and specifically in Wuhan, the issue is not really with wet markets or like markets or traditions of a specific animal consumption and the subsequent xenophobic racist description by the media, but rather the certain kinds of processes such as deforestation, urbanization, destruction of habitats that allows for interspecies jumps of disease to occur. It's something that also happened with Lyme disease in Northern America, and how the destruction of certain habitats were actually increasing the possibility of jumping between species. This is not only happening in China, but rather all around the world. At the same time, we have observed how COVID-19 has highlighted pervasive narratives towards the other in Western mentalities, with memes, with GIFs, underlying the ideologies and exclusionary policies of nation states and the media. Furthermore, this crisis has challenged the definition of the expert as well and ignited conspiranoias and of course related to racist environments. In addition to this, we have to be very wary of the idea that coronavirus is regulating any kind of relationship with the earth. the images of empty cities, wild animals reclaiming their place in urban areas, or most of them fake, like the dolphin swimming in Venice, that didn't happen, are met with images of disposable masks covering beaches all around the world. This moment does not allow nature to repair itself, so much as to show us that the capitalist productive system is still very much based on the consumption of certain resources. The final claim would be that architecture is how to engage responsibly with wider geographies, how resources are extracted, what the relationship is with other urban or rural areas, what economic, political, and ideological systems are at play, and how this architecture caters to different communities. That's all.
Fabulous. Thank you again. This is an amazing set of threads and issues put on the table. Let's just kind of give all of our presenters a thank you and a virtual round of applause in whatever way you see fit from your homes or offices, through snapping or clapping or little icons or whatever works for you. Thanks again to everybody. So we're gonna continue this discussion together for a bit, and I wanted to just sort of very quickly draw out a handful of threads. And that, I mean, to be frank, it's a strategy to stall for a moment to allow the four of you to also start to think about some questions you might have for each other, which of course you might have done already. But I was just really taken by a few interconnections that, again, I just want to take a brief minute to tease out, in particular in the context of something, a framework, a sort of phrase that Shalanda used that I'll sort of kind of build too much out for a second, was the question of design of energy policy. Right, which is to say the ways, and we see, of course, that resonates across design of COVID policy, across sort of questions of how we operate within the social sphere and attempt to sort of correlate and regulate and engage with the complexities of the transformations of social life through design means, and whether that is, and I think, and I use that term and kind of focus on that term, not only, of course, because of some of the other frameworks being put on the table, but even more specifically, I think we are getting a sense of, I guess I'll say, the ambivalence of the word design, in the sense both of its kind of capacity for, elevating qualities of life, but of course the kind of sinister aspect, the kind of more, designs that come out of a place of exploitation or increasing inequities, right? And a kind of thread across, indeed, a lot of the discussions was a recognition that plans, insofar as they're made, are often made for some groups rather than others, right? And play out inequitably, no matter how sort of effectively they might have initially been conceived. So I'm struck initially, again, yes, by that question of design and the sort of politics and inequities that are necessarily shot through, whether they be energy policy, COVID policy, various health policies, et cetera. And then one other thread, just to tease out, is around the kind of question of scale and the question of air. And again, issues that I think were playing out across a lot of across the presentations. I think in particular, I was taken by the kind of scale from the kind of energy, the kind of boilers in the shipping containers, right, to the sort of broader strains of the virus moving around the earth, right, and the sort of broader questions of these global distinctions, and how our capacity, as Andres was really focusing on, to think across scale and to develop kind of mechanisms and methods to operate across scale. So I'm drawing out these threads, both to sort of provide maybe some frameworks for a discussion moving forward, but also to focus us maybe just a little bit on some questions of method, and questions both of research method, questions of sort of method in terms of engaging broader publics and kind of thinking about research that plays out across these different resonance scales as a means of sort of working forward. And I'll just say one more thing, and one more kind of curious point to me that came through in Shalanda's talk that has to do with some of these questions of research and method. In those fascinating maps that you showed of the greater Boston area, this kind of sort of yellow to pink to dark red. And I noted that in a lot of the intermediate sort of shades, again, the scale was different, right? It was, I don't remember the exact numbers, but it was maybe 10 to 20 and then 20 to 30. And then when we get to the dark red, it was like 30 to 400 or something, right? There was a sort of larger, there was less detail in the kind of understanding of the more desperate cases, if you will. And so it's just in part to think that even, and this isn't a criticism intended as a criticism of that research or the presentation, but just a reflection on how difficult it can be to shift our sort of scale of analysis, right? I'm thinking also of the heat waves in Australia last summer when it was literally off the charts, right? There was not a color to represent 130 degrees Fahrenheit, like the purple didn't get sort of deep enough, right? And how much we're kind of in a moment of reframing, right, our scalar mechanisms or our sort of analytic mechanisms. Okay, I hope I gave you enough time now to either think of something to respond to that handful of threads I put on the table, or certainly feel free to instead turn to one of your colleagues and ask a question. Anybody want to jump in and get us started? Kian.
I think the one thing that just came up for me, Daniel, in what you're talking about when you mention scale is, I think what this year has done certainly for me, I think for many of us, is really reset or maybe blow apart our understanding of scale and how we need to shift our way of seeing things in order to really understand what's going on. So, like the most clear thing might be the maps of like the expansion of COVID around the world, how starting from like very contained geographies in China and then suddenly like emerging almost simultaneously in global terms. I think that kind of, to me, as someone who like looks at issues of space and geography, like very tangible way tangible and also like somewhat shocking way to understand the interconnections that we need to be concerned about. But then the other thing, which I think was quite surprising to me, is having to like relearn a little bit like what log scale is all about. When we looked at like the rise of cases, like to really understand like why, how compounding cases need different ways of representation to really understand what's going on. And I think that should change the way that each of us, like researches our particular our objects and our sites of analysis. And for me, who's been concerned about like how do we track through what's happening on the ground in places like Red Hook with these like constant and expanding flows of like interconnections, like flows of capital, flows of ideas, like the tangible things to the concrete things, from the very local to the planetary. I think what we've seen really blows that further apart. I'll pause for now.
Great, thank you. Other thoughts? Or?
Yeah, I totally agree with Kian, and I think that this is crucial because also we don't have that many tools to do it. So I think that identify that there's a huge difficulty in connecting what happens at one scale very close to that is planetary. It's very important. It's one of the most, in my opinion, methodological kind of challenges that we're facing, especially because there's no continuity, like the illusion of powers of 10, like you could find kind of a line that connects everything. It doesn't happen. I was interested precisely on looking at Bloomberg's effect on kind of different scales, because basically, of course, it was very good for those in Manhattan or in New York to get rid of those kind of boilers, but that immediately implied that pollution would go elsewhere. So what could work at one scale and in one particular location, as Kian is saying, situated in Manhattan or wherever, actually Red Hood was one of the cases that Bloomberg was showing. I thought, well, look, we're doing that better, like in a way. But immediately was creating a huge damage elsewhere. So a big question is, how do we find ways to, one, track this independently? Because the capacity to depict is very much also situated in very particular spheres of power. Two, what are kind of the governance, the forms of governance that allowed for a kind of trans-territorial justice and policy making? And third, how do we design in a way? What are the design tools that allowed us to gain this criticality? Because I think that basically the decision of changing a very particular infrastructure at a small scale in Manhattan has huge implications elsewhere. So how do we equip ourselves with the tools that allowed us to do that? And this is a huge question mark that I guess has to do with designers as a discipline and as a kind of political force in a way.
Yeah, can I just add one thing to what Andres is saying? So the disjunctures in scale as territory, but also disjunctures in modes of knowledge. I think the way that you know, some folks may trust this kind of like positivist, large scale scientific, like the maps that we have to trust. That's the way we know how like what's going on in the world around this. But then the positional embedded non-neutral viewpoint in order to understand like why voices from places like Red Hook and other places would matter, that is not an inevitable way to know things across these different scales and different levels of knowledge.
Yeah, I love being in this conversation because I do think, so Daniel, you mentioned a few things that I want to pick up on and threads I want to pull on. One is this idea of the non-neutrality of design, right? Which Andres really beautifully laid out in his presentation. And I think methodologically, I'm sort of doing a similar thing and sort of in my work broadly, you know, painting a picture of how the law, the systems of law and policy are not neutral, particularly in terms of their distributive consequences. And I think energy and glass are so parallel, right? Because they're so pervasive and invisible, and we don't really pay attention to them until they break or until you don't have the access, right? And so I love that as a thread that connects those two dimensions, but that they are sort of outcome determinative in terms of how you know, they influence all of these other spaces and all of these other outcomes for folks. So I love that thread. And, you know, I think as a lawyer, I often feel constrained by the discipline to be able to tell the stories that I want to tell. And I've increasingly kind of gotten into thinking about maps, gotten into thinking about spatial consequences of energy policy. And you know, I know enough to be dangerous, but I definitely love collaborating with people who, you know, find their home in geography and find their home in sort of thinking about scale and space. Yeah, I mean, I think those are the two pieces I just wanted to highlight that were top of mind coming out of that handful of comments.
I think I could add at the same time very much related to the idea of the scale and the connections between scales is even the access to information, how this information is translated in order to be intelligible, and how they are framing actually the different scales. And I think that it is very clear in the case of epidemics. Of course, I'm much more familiar with HIV/AIDS, but that was something, for example, that was very crucial, because even the access to information of how many people were affected, people that were not accounted because they had, as for example in the Haitian case, they were not accountable because, or they were not numbered because they hold a different migrant status in the United States, and their bodies were actually not part of the total number of victims of HIV/AIDS, and at the same time how the different institutions, from medical communities to governmental responses, etc., didn't provide a proper response and share information, actually changed the picture of how HIV/AIDS was understood in their different scales, that it was suddenly not affecting very specific communities. At the very beginning, in the early 80s, it was said that it was affecting the 4 H's, that it was homosexuals, heroin addicts, Haitians, I'm forgetting one right now, hemophiliacs. Sorry, but then suddenly, when precisely because of the activism in these groups actually share their own stories, their medical records, and some of the responses, suddenly the picture was way much bigger. It was not suddenly something that was affecting, imagine New York, a very specific neighborhood like the West Village, because it was claimed that it was the gay village, but that it was actually affecting a wider territory, that it was actually also struggling with forms of representation, not only in the media, but also in their own institutions. Suddenly that changed the scale of the epidemic itself, and the proper response as a collective caring, in a way. That it was not so much about the individuals, but also about how everybody was actually responding to this. And I think that it was very much connected with the design itself, from the designing of hospitals in the way that we are actually understanding buildings, infrastructures, etc., but also regulations and the way that we could be represented in a way as citizens.
Yeah, great. I want to sort of pull on one more issue, but I also want to encourage everybody at this point to go ahead and enter a question into the chat if you have one, and in general, or to a specific panelist, and we can certainly pull them out of there and bring them into the discussion. I'm struck by, you know, in this last little bit here. Again, as a sort of mode of knowledge, of research production that is a parallel both in relative to the current COVID pandemic and to the sort of ongoing climate crisis simultaneously, how much both the sort of object of knowledge, if you will, right, the virus itself or carbon in the atmosphere and its effects, is moving as much as is itself a kind of mobile object, right? Is changing every day, as are our capacities to know it, right? And I keep thinking about, I mean, some of these various issues. Well, the one that was impacting me the other day was when I was deciding if wearing a neck gaiter version face mask was acceptable and good, right? And there was some knowledge saying no and some saying yes, and you know, just struck once again, I mean, it's happened many times over the past few months, of how, not so much how little we know, but how what we know is such a narrow band, right? And has been sort of deployed for a certain set of specific interventions and according to a very specific history of the development of the virus itself. And, you know, in the parallel to that, in thinking about you know, the various IPCC reports that are always kind of, you know, starting out by saying, well, the last report, you know, we kind of were hoping we would be at point X, but really we're like, you know, 20 times beyond that. And because we can understand it better now, we understand that it's much worse than we thought it was, right? And so to speak a little too, you know, glibly about that very dramatic situation. So I guess I just want to give everyone a quick chance. We're getting a few questions in the chat, but see, the stalling tactics always work, right? But just give everyone a quick chance if you have any thoughts about that sort of, you know, moving object and moving framework of knowledge production and how they're impacting the way that we're researching and how we're moving forward. Yeah. Or I can go to questions. Bethany, please.
Yeah, thank you. I really do want to encourage people more broadly to drop questions in. And Pam, Karimi, we see you, and we will get to that question in just a second. Give Andres a moment to take a look at it in the chat. I had a slightly broader question for the whole panel, actually a much broader question. And I was hesitating to ask it because as somebody who isn't a design person, it's always striking to me how visual as opposed to how little audio or listening designers research methods tend to be. Of course, you have exceptions here, Kian, listening to people, Shalanda also, you know, lots and lots of examples. But I was really struck, Shalanda, when you were showing the maps of Boston's neighborhoods and the pollution rates and COVID rates. I've recently done a very similar mapping exercise in Philly. And what I was really struck by and actually really saddened by was that the environmental justice maps and the public health maps and the COVID maps, the COVID maps were just replicating the same types of health outcomes that we've seen since we've been collecting this and mapping this kind of data, right? And so these top-down kind of maps, I was like, they're actually not really very helpful. Like they don't get at a kind of granular history of stories that like Yvonne was just pulling forward from Greenwich Village. Like they don't really get at those. And it really made me think about research method, like, and how we get at that granular specificity that actually really helps us to understand what's going on. To me, I think what the difference in what COVID is doing right now, as opposed to like past iterations and ongoing iterations of environmental racism, is that researcher, it's like I'm not allowed to go and talk to my community partners. And it's making me crazy. And of course, my community my community partners, they don't have the kinds of tech access that we have. Like we're finding laptops to bring to people, but I'm just really wondering in terms of, to me, what has been happening, that's the huge difference in intervention here, is actually the types of participatory research methods that we have to invent that we don't yet have, that aren't good. And I just wanted to throw that to the panel, and just maybe you can commiserate, or maybe you can give some tips and solutions of like innovative practices, research methods that you've been working on.
I love that comment. And I think this is a little bit responsive to Daniel's comment as well. I mean, at the end of the day, I am a lawyer, I am an academic, and my heart is breaking daily, right? Like with every report that comes out in terms of the layers of impact on communities, which aren't sort of isolated events, right? They're a part of history. They're a part of again, without, for lack of a better term, the design of our legal structures, of our policy structures that has sort of led us to this path. I think in terms of knowledge production, there's a problem with our silos, and there's a problem with, being able to see the whole picture. And this also gets to this scale question, because we have our narrow sort of research questions that we focus on, but often they're not talking to other people. And, I make myself uncomfortable. I try to get uncomfortable in having conversations with people who may have different nomenclature for describing the same problem, but we're trying to connect so that we can get our arms around the true scale and scope of this. And I think with COVID and the way it's sort of insidiously moving throughout so many aspects of our society, I mean, we don't have an economist on this panel, but there's such a flaying open of all aspects of our economy, again, that connects to, of course, my thing is energy. So energy burden and utility cutoffs. I mean, but that connects to food insecurity and housing insecurity. I mean, there are just so many layers of this that within our different research silos, we may not necessarily connect, right? And know the true depth of how this pandemic is unfolding. And then, of course, as a policy person, I'm sort of like wondering how do we design policy if we don't have the full picture? And so you know, I've never fit fully neatly into any box. And I think in terms of my approach, my research questions are informed by people on the front lines. And that's how I know that I at least have a Lotus Star. You know, we're working with folks in California who are impacted by the fires and energy policy and you know, not having access to refrigerated food. I mean, they're just like such basics that, again, can go back to how we think about the design of our systems. So that was a lot on the table, but you know, I love both Daniel and Bethany's questions.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Shalanda, and thank you, Bethany, for bringing those issues to the fore. I'm gonna go to the chat, and any of the panelists should feel free to interrupt me at any point. I'm gonna read first a question from Elisa Slaughter. As she puts a question from the evacuation zone in Southern California. I think Elisa's at the University of Redlands. Anyway, this is what she writes. I'll just be reading it verbatim. The COVID crisis, wildfires, ongoing pollution, heat waves. She does work in Mexicali, which is regularly over 120 degrees Fahrenheit. So all of these issues raise huge questions of inside-outside as they relate to equity. There is an increasingly complicated interaction with air conditioning, access to air conditioning, access to outdoor spaces, workplace design, and requirements that seem to defy mapping and call for stories and specificity. How do you see this inside-outside dichotomy with respect to equity? Is this a design question or a story question? I'll just add also an energy question potentially, right? And I'm gonna not answer this question, which I'm quite curious about myself, but let it go to the panel. I can read any of it again if needed.
I feel like I've spoken so much, but I will say it's both, and I don't think they're mutually exclusive. So I think our stories need to inform design, and we need to understand what's happening on the ground in order to have, I loved, Kian, your framing resilience from below. So yeah, I want to let other people talk because I do feel like I've gone on and on a couple times, so.
Not at all.
I'm going just like to highlight what actually Shalanda was saying, because it's true that it is both. And I think that with COVID-19, what we are facing is actually, again, that we have to redefine this role of the expert. And it is not only that it is working in a transdisciplinary field, but that, again, it's a collective effort. And that we should take into account different definitions of the expert or the discipline, but also to work in a way together. I think that it was very clear also, like in the history of epidemics as well, that only when there were taken into account these different subjects, fields, etc., it was the proper picture and actually the proper response to an epidemic in a way. So I think that the role of the expert in that sense is really critical, and the way that we could define it and redefine it. And we are in a very good position, as we have seen, to redefine it as this mutual caring and collective effort.
Alisa is, in these lines, I think Alisa is presenting an amazing case, very concrete, that I would say that could be perfectly respond from Ivan's methodological proposal, because in a way I think that it is a question that cannot be resolved with one single perspective. We could think, for instance, that the notion of comfort needs to be challenged. The idea of a continuity between the interior and the exteriors needs to be challenged. What are the activities that would require what levels of control? It's something very important. So basically, I think that a case like this, what happens between, or kind of how do we relate interiors with the outside in a particular location, at a particular time, in the middle of such a kind of set of crises that we're facing, is something that cannot be responded from a single perspective, not without going to the details of how this particular conflict is situated in a society, in a location, in a very particular political ecosystem. This is actually the opposite of what architecture has been doing, which is basically architecture has been creating universal standards, kind of unified solutions, simplified methodologies. I think that all that is what we have to undo.
I would just add for Alyssa Slaughter's question. I mean, I agree. It's partly a design question for sure. I'm not sure what story question actually means. Maybe like a question of narrative and experiences. But for me, it's a political economy question. Like who gets to stay inside when and how is like dramatically disparate, and it's a question of political economy. And I noticed, you know, in LA right now, the super conflicted sentiments about being, firstly, certainly being able to work at home, as Shalanda was saying, but also, you know, enforcing a work at home for those who went in the context of COVID, but at the same time, you know, not wanting to be constantly relying on air conditioners because of climate change, wanting to be outside in a usually relatively pleasant environment, but not being able to be outside because of the fires that are being accelerated by climate change. There's a kind of like recursive like challenge to our ability to figure out inside and like inside what's best inside or outside and when. And I think in some ways, like this was an original framing of this session, right? This interiority, a kind of like global interiority, and we haven't really dwelled on it that much. It was in a couple of the presentations, but I think the concerns are really front and center. I say this as someone who does a lot of field work in Southeast Asia. And like for me, you know, like hanging out in Jakarta for a few hours is a little bit like hanging out in a fire zone in Southern California often. Like the particulate matter is about the same. And so after a few hours, what I do is I duck into an air-conditioned mall and spend the equivalent of $4 US. It's always $4 US wherever I go, on a cup of coffee for the privilege of being in that mall. And so I think this question actually brings into play concerns about design and concerns about like social life really, and the kinds of political economic structures that I think we all know are unjust and really need to be dismantled and transformed.
I just wanted to add, I mean, this reminds me of Yvonne's, a couple of his slides around home, right? I mean, if we think about one simple policy and public health response, which was stay home. Okay, well, that ignores all the people who don't have home. That ignores all the people who live in a certain kind of way at home. That you know, again, it just sort of spirals. And also, we're going to teach our kids from home. Okay, access to computers. Obviously, this has had a disproportionate impact on women because of the way we've organized our society, and women are now dropping out of the workforce. I mean, it's just, we have to think about these underlying, you know, social dimensions, the political economy of how our COVID response has unfolded to really get at some of these inequalities. So just been a lot of fun to hear everyone's different perspectives.
Yeah, thank you both. And I'm gonna give Pamela Karimi's question just a few quick minutes response. A compelling question. Pamela of UMass Dartmouth, a fellow architectural historian and close colleague. A question to Andres in particular, but in fact it relates to some of the things we were just discussing. Are there any recent design solutions for the super wealthy in light of COVID, thinking perhaps along the lines of the survival condo project in Kansas, And then she goes on in a sort of second part around questions of subterranean luxury apartments and these kind of, caves that produce, and, again, this kind of inside outside, and then also the question of these technologies of filtering and management of air in different ways. So Andres, I'll turn it to you if you have any thoughts on that.
Well, it's a terrific question because in a way, I think it has two parts. One has to do with the actual architecture of power now. I think that this is a very important question because the architecture of power is not what it used to be. In the 70s, for instance, the first glass that was reflecting sun was very, very visible. It was all this kind of bronze looking glass. The reflective glass was called at that time. And then progressively, the capacity of filtering became invisible. And that's something that I think is not only a metaphor, it's physically constructing the possibility to overlap with others, but not being there. So the possibility for the superpowers now of being in the same place where others are, but being given very different conditions, physical, material, ideological, agencies, bodily capacities is huge. These kits that Dr. Sang is designing are kits that are screened. Their embryos are screened in a way to avoid a number of all the known genetically transmitted diseases. So basically, we're witnessing the architecture of power becoming invisible. And that is something that is very critical because we don't have the tools to politically intervene those things that are invisible. So I think a big part of our work as architects and as activists is unpacking that, making that visible, finding the tools to operate there and to set limits to that. So I think your question is very crucial because, yeah, the condominiums to create this kind of possibility to detach a part, or at least to try to detach a part of society from others are there, but are very sophisticated architectural design tools that are very different for us, or very difficult for us to scrutinize. The second part, I think, is a question about our societies at large, and what is the way that we're seeing the model of kind of an elite sort of dynamizing the entire economy working. That is a model, of course, that was very much promoted by colonial powers across the world at different scales. And we are seeing the cracks of that. That is not working anymore. And that is, or never worked, actually, it never worked. But now we have like the huge evidence of how that failed. And I think it's also our responsibility to say it very clear, that's not working. So it's not that it's problematic, it's that it's not working for anyone, not even for the super rich. So the super rich were the first ones that were dying, precisely because they were traveling. And they were, so the first weeks, those that were dying of COVID-19 were basically very wealthy people, mostly across the world, I would say, not necessarily in Wuhan, where what it was different. But when it came to Europe, when it arrived to Italy, when it arrived to other locations, basically it's very interesting how some people were tracking that it was precisely affecting those that were traveling. And that is very much related to the financial capacity, and therefore it was showing very clearly the vulnerability of those that believed that they were saved.
Thank you. And thank you all. I think we're going to have to start tying this off, unfortunately. And as happens far too often, just as everything is really starting to get exciting, and I'm thinking so many things, and not that it wasn't happening all along, but I guess we're going out on a peak, if you will, right? I mean, I think there's really a lot on the table and so much we could continue to discuss. And really, you know, the project of this panel in many ways, and this sort of opening up of this topic for the year, was to pull in these thoughts and responses and sort of give ourselves all some contexts and frameworks and kind of ways of moving forward as we think about the challenges we're collectively facing in this seemingly unexpected, now we're used to it a little bit, maybe, I don't know, but nonetheless a context that feels very unexpected and difficult to manage. So thank you all for your brilliant contributions. Thank you to the audience and for your questions and attention, to Bethany, to Angela and others who helped put this together. And we'll give ourselves a second to unmute and say goodbye, and thanks again. So thank you all. Wonderful stuff.
Thank you.
Thank you so
Thank you.
Yes, and we'll be in touch. We'll be in touch. Great to see you all. Thanks again.
Thanks all
Okay.
for being here. Bye.
Bye.